And now, Useful Idiots. In the first of two programmes, John Sweeney unpacks a phrase used to describe otherwise intelligent men and women who praise and therefore give credibility to tyrants and tyrannies.
The
voice of Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union for 3 decades, psychopath, killer of millions, but to some at the time, nothing less than the saviour of humanity. In 2 programmes for the BBC World Service, I shall be looking at the useful idiots. First, those Westerners who worship Stalin, and then those useful idiots, perhaps, of more recent times. Professor Donald Rayfield, author of Stalin and His Hangman, defines a phrase often attributed to Lenin.
The phrase seems to have been around for about 70 years. It's someone who doesn't think they're an idiot, who thinks they're highly intelligent, but is so easily persuaded by flattery from people in power that they're prepared to serve their purposes and allow themselves to be duped or even just to lie for the sake of advantage.
To try and get a grip on what the useful idiots did, I've come to Sochi, and I'm standing in front of an enormous green villa, and if I have only one word to describe it, that word is creepy. Pожалуйста. Now, very little has changed in this place since Stalin last came here in the early 50s, shortly before he died. Climbing up the stairs, and here is a grand banqueting hall. There are 2 pictures, Stalin in military uniform, an oil painting looking over a map, and from the bend in the river, I guess that's Stalingrad. Immediately opposite, hanging over the fireplace, there's another picture of him. He looks strong, cocksure. Obviously the pictures didn't emphasise the fact that he was pockmarked from smallpox, that he had a withered left hand, that he was conspicuously short even for his time.
He said, I'm going to tell you that everything you have heard on this trip is nonsense. The truth is quite different.
Doris Lessing, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature and once a devout communist. In 1952, she was part of a delegation visiting the Soviet Union and being shown all that Stalin's minders wanted them to see. Then one old man spoke out.
Now, for him to say this at all was brave of him, to put it mildly. Everybody around him is all very jolly and upbeat and nice and sweet. The thing was, he was completely out of line with anything going on. For me, it was shattering.
So would Doris Lessing now say she had been Stalin's useful idiot?
Yes, I would. That's what my role was. I was taken around and shown things as a useful idiot. I would then go away and say, oh, it's very nice and it's all so sweet, which now I can't understand myself thinking that, but I did, you see. I can't understand why I was so gullible.
As George Orwell said, I paraphrase, there are some things so stupid that only an intellectual could believe them.
Oliver Cam, leader writer on the London Times.
And the idea that a new civilization was being built on the bodies of those purged and shot in Stalinist Russia was a fantastic misconception. The character of that delusion, I think, derives from the intellectual's belief in his own powers of observation. But the intellectual believes that he or she can understand the imperfections of his own society and understand how an alternative civilization is being built.
I could have danced all night, I could have danced all night.
This from My Fair Lady, the musical version of Pygmalion, a play by George Bernard Shaw. The man who created Eliza Doolittle met Stalin in the Kremlin in 1931 and waxed lyrical about him. Meanwhile, thousands were being shot, hundreds of thousands perishing in the ice hell of the Gulag, and millions dying of man-made famine. Stalin could have killed all night. Was Shaw just a fool? Donald Rayfield.
Shaw had really strong dictatorial instincts. He was in favour of very summary solutions to the world's problems, and he rather liked the idea of a revolution that swept unnecessary people away. It's something rather like many of the characters in his plays, shocking the world by overriding all the existing conventions.
The man who inspired My Fair Lady, he wrote the play Pygmalion, was a bit of a dictator?
Well, Professor Higgins is a bit of a dictator, a bit of a Stalin, if you think what he does to Eliza.
He doesn't shoot her.
No, he completely transforms her. Shaw overlooked the starvations and the shootings. What he liked was the complete turning upside down of a society. That as far as he was concerned, what Professor Higgins was doing to a working-class girl, Stalin was doing to a working class of an entire country.
The useful idiots blinded themselves to the result of Stalin's attack on the peasantry, the man-made famine in southern Russia and the Ukraine in the early 1930s. A handful of Western voices dared to contradict the official lie that there was no famine. One such, Malcolm Muggeridge, journalist and related to Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who'd written what they called a fact-filled book about Stalin's achievements. Richard Ingrams is Muggeridge's biographer and friend.
He went to Russia in 1932 with his wife, Kitty, and apparently with the intention that they were going to live there. They were emigrating to Russia. They had this link with the Webbs, which was an enormous plus from Malcolm's point of view, because it connected him with the Webbs, who, from Stalin's point of view, were two of the most effective propagandists in the West that he had.
You knew, well, what Muggeridge said about the Webb's book, every single figure in it was wrong. It was all a fantasy.
It was. It was called Soviet Russia, A New Civilization. And when it first came out, there was a question mark after civilization. But after meeting Uncle Joe, the question mark was removed.
But the point is, Stalin was a mass murderer.
He was. Malcolm, when he saw the light about Russia, he did take it up with Aunt Beau, as they called her. She said, of course, it's quite true that in Russia people do disappear. And Malcolm thought, well, actually she was quite keen about that, because she would have quite liked to have the same power. The whole idea of Stalin's supreme power appealed to her. And the idea that, if people disagreed with you or made a lot of trouble, they could disappear. And that was, from her point of view, it was quite nice.
One common trait of the useful idiots is they were happy to idolise Stalin's Russia, but not to live there.
There are always people who invest their hopes in a faraway country of which they know little. I knew Malcolm's great friend, and he was a great friend of mine, Claude Cockburn, and he was a communist. He never expressed the slightest desire to go to Russia. He liked going to America, but he never wanted to go to Russia, and I think he knew that if he got there, he would find it a most horrible place. But he still held on to this dream. It's a kind of pseudo-religious feeling that there is a heaven on earth.
Another believer in a golden future under Stalin, and it turns out the target of a secret police honey trap, was H.G. Wells, author of the science fiction classic War of the Worlds. Donald Rayfield.
H.G. Wells was singled out because he was one of the very few foreigners who was actually present in the early days of the Revolution and was extremely excited by it. And then he had a personal entanglement with Mura Budberg, the daughter of a Tsarist general, who was involved with the Soviet secret police. And one other way in which intellectuals were seduced by Stalin was they were found extremely attractive women to take back home with them.
The Webbs, there was no sexual entrapment of Sidney or Beatrice, was there?
You couldn't possibly have entrapped Sidney or Beatrice in any sexual web whatsoever. The entrapment there was to show that their theories could exist in a three-dimensional real world. I have seen the future and it works. That was the other illusion that foreign intellectuals could get, that Stalin could show them.
Stalin's bedroom. It would be wonderful if children who are learning history could come to this room, because if you come to Stalin's bedroom, you feel what the man is like. It hasn't changed a bit, and it's full of crepuscular gloom. Drapes, no light, heavy furniture, Victorian. And the presence of the man, I feel, is real. It's creepy being here. While Stalin slept royally in this magnificent bed, millions of Russians starved. Millions upon millions upon millions of Russians feared the knock on their door in the middle of the night.
A picture in music of Stalin's bloodlust, the second movement of Dmitri Shostakovich's 10th Symphony. The whole work is an examination of suffering. Born in Liverpool, England, Walter Duranty of the New York Times was Stalin's great apologist. A wit, a cynic, surrounded by beautiful Russian women, Duranty led the Moscow press pack from his perch at the bar of the Metropole Hotel. When Muggeridge reported the Great Famine, Duranty played a double game. His biographer, Sally Taylor, described to the BBC World Service how he privately reported to the British Embassy the number of deaths.
Duranty estimated 10 million, and that's the highest estimate I've seen.
So this is a famine which Duranty himself said 10 million people died.
That's right.
What did he put in his newspaper?
He wrote, "No actual starvation or deaths from starvation, but there is widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition."
But no famine.
But no famine.
He was lying.
He was lying, yes.
Whereas Hitler's apologists in the 30s didn't know about the Holocaust to come, Duranty knew about the millions who were dying under Stalin, but airbrushed them out of history. Why would he do that? Sally Taylor and Donald Rayfield.
Aleister Crowley was a witch, a warlock, and he organized the Paris workings, which were a psycho-sadistic set of practices for which Walter Duranty wrote the poetry. And there was a lot of tying people up in chains and carving crosses in their chest, things like that.
Do you think this had an impact on him later on in life?
I think something was missing in him. One way of putting it is he seemed to be soulless.
The point about Duranty was he was being blackmailed for some sorts of sexual misdemeanors, we don't know quite what.
How do you know that?
It's in the Jagoda files that they have a commentary on Duranty. And that is why people like Duranty went on to say that the show trials were models of legal jurisprudence and so on.
The other day there was a Newsweek journalist who there's compromat video of him cutting up what looks like cocaine with the beautiful Russian lovely. Same old tricks?
Same thing, yes. It sometimes doesn't work with the French, I'm told. They say, "Oh, thank you, my wife will be proud of me."
Walter Duranty, the blackmailed reporter, encouraged the United States to recognize the Soviet Union. For this, he won a Pulitzer Prize, the great moment of a life, which was to end amid poverty and disgrace. The New York Times, of course, publishes articles. Do they still show off his Pulitzer? Sally Taylor.
They do have the Pulitzers lined up in a room. I was taken in there and shown all the Pulitzers. And underneath Duranty's Pulitzer, there's a little sign that says, "Many people feel he did not deserve the Pulitzer and that his reportage on the famine was inadequate, and many of them were on the staff." Without saying that he falsified the reports, they're saying, we know that this is a disgraceful period of time for us.
This is the entrance to Firm 36. It's a real-life Stalinist concentration camp. It was started in 1946, and it was kept open and full of prisoners, open for business, long past Stalin's death and up till the late 70s, when it's finally closed down. There's an ocean of barbed wire. Also, some of it's electrified. I see those white ceramic cups which would carry the electric current. There is a sense of real bleakness a kind of barbed wireness of the mind. And the only living thing is a grey cat licking its tail. Back then, in Stalin's day, that cat wouldn't have lived very long here. It would have been eaten because people were so desperately hungry.
One other man who blew the whistle on Stalin's Great Famine, Gareth Jones, a Welsh journalist and brilliant linguist. His niece, Margaret Cyril Colley, explains how Jones got the scoop of his life.
Because he spoke Russian fluently, he managed to go to a station outside Moscow and go on a peasant's train, on a third-class train, to Ukraine. He got off the train just before the border of Ukraine because people weren't allowed to cross into Ukraine, and he walked along the railway and he met peasants, he spoke to them. He was apprehended by the secret police during this period when he was interviewing peasants, and he was then taken to Kharkov, where he saw the famine. He saw the thousands of people queuing for bread outside a shop.
Jones reported on what he'd seen in the Ukraine fearlessly. Back in Moscow, Duranty made him out to be a liar. 2 years later, Jones went to China. His driver and tour guide, it later came out, were agents for Stalin's secret police, the NKVD. Jones was killed in mysterious circumstances. Stalin's revenge? That's hard to discover, because the Kremlin today is run by Vladimir Putin, former secret policeman, and a man eager to rewrite history in Stalin's favour, which is why the new history book in Russian schools dismisses the famine in one paragraph. What did Donald Rayfield make of the charge that Stalin had Jones killed?
It isn't proven, but it's very possible, and perhaps somewhere in the files in Moscow the evidence will be found. One interesting thing is that these useful idiots, if they proved to be not so useful, did meet their deaths rather early.
The files on all these cases, and Gareth Jones too, they'll be in the NKVD files.
Yes, I'm sure. They haven't been opened yet.
Why haven't they been opened yet?
Because basically the same organisation that worked under Stalin is still working today, with some cosmetic changes.
But today there is a difference. There are no useful idiots for Prime Minister Putin.
I suppose idiocy is too polite a word for it. It's complete cynicism. The decision to rehabilitate Stalin partially as an excellent manager, personnel manager number one, I suppose you have to agree with that, and as the man who won the war. I think many historians would say that the Russians won the war despite Stalin, not because of him.
As the day of his execution neared, Jones kept his spirits up by singing. His niece remembers the uncle she last saw when she was 10.
I do remember being down at my grandparents' in Barry, and he came in and showed me some photos of starving children. And I thought to myself, how on earth could these fat children, because they had bloated stomachs, how on earth could they be starving if they looked so fat? So I do remember him coming and showing me these pictures.
He sang songs, he sang hymns.
Oh, yes, yes. He did Welsh songs. He loved singing. And he sang David of the White Rock, which is a very famous, rather melodious Welsh song.
Give me a burst of the tune.
Calon lan adadaioni, calon lan adonaioni.
That's lovely. That's lovely.
United forever in friendship and labor, our mighty republics will ever...
There's no mistaking the voice of the American singer Paul Robeson. A communist, disgusted by America's oppression of its black minority, Robeson fell hook, line and sinker for Stalin's propaganda machine.
Long live our Soviet motherland.
On return visits to Russia, he'd look up old friends, long since swallowed up into the Gulag. Donald Rayfield.
These people were taken out of prison, given a shave, clean shirt, fed for a few days, shown to Paul Robeson, look, he's alive and well and happy. And when Paul Robeson left, went back to America, back they went to prison and then to death.
Robeson was a true believer.
Well, he was politically very naive, he knew no history, he was a singer. For an American Negro, when you felt a second-class citizen, If it was much as second class in your own country, the Soviet Union could put itself forward as a non-racist country in which all could be treated equally, and it was very, very hard for people like Robeson to resist that sort of treatment.
Some useful idiots may not have been bad people, just horribly fooled. But they do not deserve our compassion. Stalin's victims do. The poet Anna Akhmatova once told of how, in the terrible years of the Yezhov terror, she spent 17 months waiting in line outside the prison in Leningrad. Anna said, "Standing behind me was a woman, with lips blue from the cold, who whispered, 'Can you describe this?' And I said, 'I can.' Then something like a smile passed fleetingly over what had once been her face." In that spirit, decades on, another flash of human comedy from Svetlana Stalin, daughter of the tyrant, Richard Ingram's.
Malcolm is sitting in his cosy sitting room in the Sussex countryside with Kitty, and they're having tea with Stalin's daughter. Isn't that bizarre?
How did they get on?
Well, they got on very well to begin with, but Svetlana, who took after her dad in certain ways, had a way of turning against people for no very good reason. They were making a TV programme, of course, and the producer wanted Kitty to show Svetlana round the garden. And Kitty, who was hopeless at that sort of thing, she didn't know what to say and said, "Oh, look at these lovely flowers. Do you have nice flowers in Siberia?" And Svetlana flew into a rage. and said, "Do not talk to me about Siberia."
It's hard to imagine how anyone in the 21st century could repeat the mistakes of the Kremlin's useful idiots. I'll examine that more closely for the BBC's World Service in the next programme. Meanwhile, the last word goes to Professor Donald Rayfield, who sums up the false logic which drives useful idiots into the hands of dictators.
One of the reasons, of course, was that people felt there was only one Satan, and anyone against that particular Satan could not possibly be a devil himself.
Oh, that's tough. You can only deal with one Satan at any one time.
I think that, unfortunately, is something common to most intellectuals and all politicians. So it's this business of feeling that the enemy of your enemy cannot possibly be anything but a friend.
Part 1 of Useful Idiots was presented by John Sweeney and produced by David Coombs. It was a CTVC production for BBC World Service.
There are dozens of different podcasts now available from the BBC, including news, documentaries, science, business, arts and sport. For details of them all, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Now, in the second of his two programmes on useful idiots, John Sweeney turns his attention to modern times, and he starts in China.
In April '69, Communist Party delegates assemble for their 9th Congress, Mao's victorious conclusion to the Cultural Revolution. By now he's ousted his opponents, and the shouts of "Long live" are louder than ever.
The sound of tyranny from Mao Zedong's China. This is the second of two programmes on the BBC World Service, looking at useful idiots, a loaded term attributed to Lenin. First, a definition, historian Donald Rayfield, and then journalist Bruce Anderson.
It's someone who doesn't think they're an idiot, who thinks they're highly intelligent, but is so easily persuaded by flattery from people in power that they're prepared to serve their purposes and allow themselves to be duped, or even just to lie for the sake of advantage.
Intellectuals have a terrible tendency to adjust the evidence to fit their preconceptions. If they decide they want to believe in something, they will believe in it. And if the evidence says, "Oi, you're wrong," they'll just hit the evidence over the head until it shuts up.
In our democratic age, the world's most populous country still labours under the one-party rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Under the totalitarian rule of Chairman Mao, things were much worse. Correction, under Mao, some say, the East was rosy red. Oliver Cam, leader writer on the London Times.
There were others on the political left, including the liberal left, who did see China as some sort of alternative, efficient and joyous, even, way of doing things differently. And this was partly a testament to the stupidity of intellectuals, partly a function of the lack of information about China, particularly the terrible details of the Great Famine and then the Cultural Revolution. But above all, it was this recurrent belief among Western intellectuals that because there are imperfections in their own societies, there must be better ways of doing them outside, and alighting on appalling dictatorships as working examples of how to do things differently.
From 1959 to 1961, millions died of famine under Mao's murderous misrule. The evidence, says China expert Jonathan Mirsky, was hard to miss.
If you were just in Hong Kong, you could see in 1960 and 61 huge queues of people outside the post offices in Hong Kong sending food packages up to China where they knew people were starving to death. And the dead bodies of people who had starved to death were floating down the river and arriving in Hong Kong harbor. So this was not a secret. It was only a secret if you didn't want to know.
In the early 70s, Mirsky, as a young academic, went to China on an approved trip. They saw a brilliantly constructed fiction.
This is 1972. Every single school in China was closed because of the Cultural Revolution. We were taken to schools where there were classes, where there were teachers. It looked normal. People were very friendly. Oh, you're Americans. How nice of you to come here.
But the schools, that was all show.
These were Potemkin schools. In Russia, when they wanted the Tsar to think that things were going well, one of his ministers, a man called Potemkin, arranged for certain villages to look good in a certain way. And the word Potemkin has now entered the language as a showplace for people whom the authorities wished to fool. It was very, very easy to do. Why would a dozen people with PhDs believe it when somebody says, there's no crime here? And we all wrote it down in our little notebooks, no crime in China. Afterwards, when I met one of our minders a few years later, when I went back to China, he said, we wanted to put rings in your noses and you helped us put them there.
Finally, Jonathan Mirsky began to glimpse the truth, as he came to see it, about Mao.
He had an enormous impact on China, but he was also a monster, and he made Chinese suffer for years. Let me quote one of Mao's secretaries, a man called Li Rui, about 10 years ago, who was brave enough in his 80s to say Mao liked killing.
How many people did he kill?
I think a better question is how many people died before their time because of Mao. Now, if you take the Great Famine of 1959-61, where the usual estimate, which is careful, is 30 million people. It's the worst man-made famine in history. That was completely down to Mao because of his lunatic policies about how agriculture should be organized and his punishment of people who dared to criticize him. So let's say that 30 million people died before their time in the famine. And let's say that a few million people died during the Cultural Revolution, killed by Red Guards and others. I mean, it's easy to get to 40 million people. Easy.
That didn't seem to worry the British Prime Minister in the early 70s, Edward Heath, who later became a regular visitor to China. Journalist Bruce Anderson.
I'm afraid Edward Heath had a monstrous bladder of vanity. He liked going to China because in China he was treated not barely as a head of government, he was virtually treated as a head of state. He was treated with flattery, with unctuousness, as if he was still in power, as if he was a great man. And I'm afraid he doesn't come out well from that episode. All his critical faculties were overwhelmed. As long as they patted his tummy, he was prepared to roll over like a pet panda.
Tony Benn, veteran socialist and former British politician, lived through the Cold War believing that what mattered in Washington, D.C. was not what kind of monster a ruler was, so long as he was ours. So what did Benn make of Mao?
Mao's role in preventing China from being permanently occupied by the Americans was, I think, a significant role, and I think China's development strategy of going to the countryside and building it up there has played a significant role in building China up as a major power. So I think he would have to rank as a great figure in Chinese history.
Mao was a mass murderer. Surely in the balance, if he's a great man, he's also a great monster too.
I've no doubt that there were aspects of Mao's life and record which I would deeply deplore. But at the same time, you just have to look back on history. How do people look at Napoleon? How do people look at various figures who would have done hideous things but had a significant historical role? One of the aspects of the Cold War was that you were not allowed to think a single good thing about the countries that were your enemies in the Cold War.
Tony Benn has 5 questions to ask any dictator. They're rather good.
What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how could we get rid of you?
Did you ask those questions in China?
Well, the best I could. I mean, we had endless discussions about all these things. But my purpose was not to go there to have an argument, but to go there and try and discover what they were doing and why, and put thoughts to them that I hoped would be helpful, and indicate that not everyone in the West was hostile to their countries.
Oliver Cam here unpacks the fundamental difference he sees between useful idiots who hold conflicting political views.
I think it comes down to the distinction between liberalism in its broadest sense, which regards human beings as perhaps more malleable than they really are, though I stand on the left myself, and conservatism, which has a more sceptical streak by nature, by philosophy. And because left-wing autocratic regimes tend to describe their operations in terms of service to humanity, the new type of human being, the new society, they tend to attract a simple-minded admiration of people on the left that those of a more conservative disposition would doubt. Useful idiots on the right tend to think rather differently. They look at brutal regimes and regard them as undiplomatic, maybe repressive, but better than the alternative.
So, to some examples. When Chile's former dictator was held under house arrest in Surrey, England, for a short spell, some people wanted to shake the hands of the London policeman who said, "General Pinochet, you're under arrest." Former government minister Norman Lamont was not one of them, campaigning instead for his quick release. As they tell the BBC World Service, Oliver Cam believes Lamont to have been Pinochet's useful idiot. Bruce Anderson emphatically does not.
People such as Lord Lamont, the former Chancellor, who regard the Pinochet regime as, again, more sinned against than sinning, and whatever the brutal measures meted out to Chilean dissidents was nonetheless a bastion of Western values in South America. That's a conceptual error and a moral one. Chile was actually one of the most appalling instances of sins of commission as well as omission by US foreign policy in that decade.
Pinochet's coup was necessary to prevent Chile from going communist. Even his critics only allege he killed, I think, under 4,000 people. If you have a big country and a threat of a communist takeover, that's quite a low casualty rate.
4,000 people, that's an acceptable price. 4,000 deaths.
Look, there will have been a lot of innocent victims, because you can't launch a coup on liberal and humane grounds. Once you decide to have a coup, first of all, you've got to win power quickly, you've got to suppress opposition quickly, you've got to deal with potential enemies quickly. It's a very unpleasant business. But if you look at the other alternatives when Pinochet took over, I think it was one of the more humane possible alternatives.
This afternoon, the first funeral in Cape Town for one of the victims of last week's confrontations with authority. Whites did not put the government in power to hand that power to the blacks. But after a year of funerals, there does appear to be a growing realization in this country that things will have to change.
In the 1980s, quite a few British Conservatives visited apartheid South Africa as a guest of the white minority regime. One was a young hopeful in the Conservative Research Department, David Cameron, now Britain's Prime Minister. Since then, Mr Cameron has publicly disavowed Mrs Thatcher's nuanced stance on apartheid and condemned it. Another guest of the apartheid state was journalist Bruce Anderson. Is he a useful idiot too?
Let's define our terms. Apartheid means apartness. Apartheid was a daft idea, and like many of the daftest ideas in the world, it was invented in a university by intellectuals. And the theory was that you would divide up South Africa, and all the races would have their portion of the country. Now that in itself is not an immoral idea. If it had been a third, it was just a crazy one, because you can't run a modern country that way. By the time I first started to go to South Africa, a lot of apartheid had been dismantled, and everyone knew that fundamental political change was on the way. So no, I don't think I was being a useful idiot.
It went deeper than people like Bruce Anderson, of course. What about the Thatcher government's fight against sanctions? Oliver Cam.
I don't believe for a moment that Mrs. Thatcher had sympathy for the system of apartheid, but she gave every appearance at the time of opposing sanctions more passionately than she did the racist regime in Pretoria. Underneath that, there were members of the Conservative Party in the House of Commons who were friendly with the regime, who regarded its racial discrimination as a sort of idiosyncrasy compared with the more fundamental question that South Africa was a bastion against communism in that continent. That was a terrible judgment and an immoral one.
Now, what were Tony Benn's 5 questions for a tyrant again?
What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how could we get rid of you?
Did you ask your 5 questions to Saddam Hussein?
No, but I went particularly to ask him to release the hostages, which he did. And then I went again just before the war. Do you have weapons of mass destruction, I asked. He said no. I didn't know whether to believe him, but it was true. And then I had an open discussion.
How can you have an open discussion with a mass murderer?
Well, you talk to anybody. I mean, I think it depends on how you see the process of democracy. I think you have to talk to anybody.
When in power, Saddam had people dumped in acid baths, strangled, shot, and made their families pay for the bullets. He gassed the Kurds, killing thousands. But when George Galloway, then a prominent member of Britain's Parliament and opponent of Western sanctions against Iraq, met Saddam, there was no mention of that.
Sir, I salute your courage, your strength, your indefatigability, and I want you to know that we are with you, Hatal Nasser, Hatal Nasser, Hatal Quds.
He said, "Sir, I salute you for your strength, your courage, your indefatigability."
Oliver Cam.
His rationalisation afterwards was that he was addressing the Iraqi people, which, in my view, was an absurd explanation. He was directly addressing a dictator who, outside North Korea, had no peer at that time. And to imply that the Iraqi people were somehow able to organise themselves, have some sort of civic society under this regime was patently preposterous.
Would you say that George Galloway is a useful idiot of our time?
Yes, because he gave sustenance and succour to a terrible, terrible dictatorship.
He would say, I think, listen, there are voices upon voices upon voices all saying the same thing, that essentially Western capitalism, Western society is the kind of dominant voice in all the Western media. And real questions about Palestine, about the suffering of the Iraqi people under Western sanctions are never properly raised.
It's perfectly possible to identify in a disinterested, objective way, without fear or favour, suffering in Palestine or crimes of omission and commission by the Western democracies, and there have been many of those. But it's quite another to obfuscate the crimes of not just imperfect, frequently culpable governments such as our own, but utterly oppressive dictatorships.
Across the border in Iran, Shahab Musavat worked for Press TV, Iran's state-sponsored TV channel. At first, things went well, but then came the presidential elections.
Whereas previously Press TV had been this fountain, this font of liberality, suddenly the powers that be told us that we were no longer at liberty to criticise or to put in any sort of challenging journalism so far as the presidency was concerned. We were told that we had to tone down anything that might be construed as supportive of Mr. Mousavi or any of those that were standing in opposition to Mr. Ahmadinejad. And as we went forward, it became even more apparent that really the editorial freedoms that we had enjoyed unprecedented really in Iran, were going to be done away with.
Shortly before voting day, Shahab Mousavat resigned from Press TV. When protesters claiming that President Ahmadinejad had stolen the election filled the streets, he phoned up his old channel and asked them a question.
I asked the simple question, are you covering this? Are you covering this? This actually cost me much more than I ever imagined. This throwaway remark, a very simple question that any journalist, I think, should ask.
This being the demonstration by hundreds of thousands of people in Tehran saying that the election was a fraud. Did they cover the demonstrations?
They didn't cover the violence by the government authorities, but they certainly covered the protests and tried to persuade the world at large that in fact it was the demonstrators who were the orchestrators of the violence. That is entirely to turn the issues on their head.
Journalist Maziar Bahari was in Tehran covering the protests when the authorities asked him for a quiet word.
9 days after the election, on June 21st, I was arrested and I spent 118 days in Evin prison, 107 days out of those 118 days in solitary confinement.
Give me some idea of what happened to you while you were there.
Basically, there were a lot of beatings, punchings, slapping, but repeatedly. They wanted me to confess that I was a spy.
Did they break you?
They made me confess to say that the Western media was bad. I apologized to the Supreme Leader, but I never cooperated with them fully.
Are you a spy?
No, I'm not, and I was not, and I told them that.
One day, Maziar Bahari was taken from his cell into another room in the prison. Enter Press TV.
There were 3 camera crews there. But it really surprised me to see Press TV in that room because I thought that at least they would try to pretend that they are good journalists. And I don't think any good journalist in good conscience would interview another journalist in prison, under duress, with a blindfold on his knee, in prison uniform, and cooperate with the interrogator to come up with questions.
The first thing that you actually noticed about this place was the smell, the absolute reek of feces everywhere.
Shahab Mousavat.
This was hell, basically. You felt like you were going beyond the brink of anything normal. The next thing that you notice is the screams, and there's a lot of torture going on there, and you hear that. And I tell you, all this time later, it still lives with me.
Has Press TV ever covered torture in Shahpur?
If you ask Press TV, I'm sure they tell you that no such thing exists. So I think the answer to that is no.
Whereas some Westerners who worked for Press TV left after its editorial line swung behind the regime, George Galloway, and the journalist famous for having been captured by the Taliban, Yvonne Ridley, did not, and both continue to work for Press TV in Britain. I asked Maziar Bahari, are they, in his book, useful idiots?
I cannot call anyone an idiot without knowing them personally, but I think they are useful for Iranian government.
How?
They are basically used by the Iranian government to send their message of hate through Press TV. And by the very fact that they are working for Press TV, they are working for the Iranian government, and they are part of this propaganda machine of the Iranian government.
George Galloway and Yvonne Ridley both declined to take part in this programme, but sent emails. On Iraq, Mr. Galloway says he was a known opponent of Saddam Hussein at a time when British and American businessmen and politicians were queuing up to do business with him. He adds that his words reported as directed at Saddam were in fact directed at the Iraqi people. On Iran, Mr. Galloway says he is responsible for his own work on Press TV and has in fact criticised the Iranian government on Press TV and elsewhere, including a denunciation of a Holocaust conference in Tehran to which Holocaust deniers were invited. Yvonne Ridley says, I am no more of a useful idiot to President Ahmadinejad when the BBC Director General Mark Thompson was a useful idiot for suppressing further criticism of the British government's dodgy dossier and the illegal invasion of Iraq, which led to the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. In fact, John, are you not a useful idiot yourself for the BBC? Perhaps I am a useful idiot, but as I reply to Yvonne Ridley, one difference is the BBC does report criticism of the British government, and Press TV does not report criticism of the Iranian government. Nor does the BBC interview torture victims while in prison and pretend they're at liberty. It seems as though the age of useful idiots is not quite dead yet.
Useful Idiots was presented by John Sweeney and produced by David Coombs. It was a CTVC production for BBC World Service.
There are dozens of different podcasts now available from the BBC, including news, documentaries, science, business, arts and sport. For details of them all, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.